it's kind of wild how ideas from like centuries ago still kind of hit home today. We're diving into war, and justice, like how nations deal with each other, from those medieval philosophers all the way to like international law and how it's all changed.
Yeah, it's a long history. Thinkers, like way back when, they really struggled with this whole idea of a just war. Like, what makes it okay to fight in the first place? And then how do those principles actually play out in different situations,
Right, because it's not just about deciding I have to fight. It's also about, like the HLW. They were debating if certain weapons were even morally acceptable. You know what I mean?
Totally. They were super focused on limiting harm to, like, the people who weren't actually fighting, keeping the battlefield kind of separate. Of course, it wasn't, like, a perfect system, but they were really trying to draw these moral lines, even in the middle of a war.
Which, I mean, you can imagine how tough that gets.
Oh, for sure. And it still is. Like, think about the use of civilians as human shields that just completely throws things for a loop, creates this moral mess for, like, everybody involved.
Totally. And speaking of moral minefields, nationalism is another one. It's like, on one hand, it can bring people together, but then it can also lead to all this exclusion and conflict.
Exactly. It's this like constant tension between having a shared identity and the potential for that identity to turn into exclusion or even violence. It's tricky because, like, wanting to protect your culture, your people, that's natural, but it can so easily slip into this thing where your nation has to be better than others, not just different.
And that's where things get really dark really fast. Like what happened in Yugoslavia, that whole conflict, was just this crash course in how toxic nationalism can get.
Oh, it's heartbreaking. Because you see how easily fear and resentment, this whole us versus them mentality, it can be manipulated. And suddenly you have these horrific acts being justified as self-defense, even when it's obvious that a whole group of people is being targeted just because of who they are.
It makes you think, like, okay, so if things are going that bad, is there ever a point where intervening is the right thing to do? But then who gets to make that call? And when is it actually justified?
Oh, man, that is like the million-dollar question in international ethics, especially after everything that went down in the 20th century. There was this huge push to try to prevent stuff like genocide from ever happening again. So the UN steps in, right? But then you run into all these issues of like a country's right to govern itself, accusations of double standards. It's complicated.
It's like that whole responsibility to protect thing.
Yeah.
Sounds great in theory, but putting it into practice, whole different story.
You got it, because where's the line? Between a genuine humanitarian intervention and just using human rights as a way to cover up other motives, it's often really blurry. And it brings up even more questions like, can you ever really be impartial in those situations? Does getting the military involved actually fix anything in the long run? There are just no easy answers.
Yeah.
It sounds pretty straightforward, this idea of punishing wrongdoing as a reason to go to war. But when you really dig into it, it gets messy.
Yeah, like how do you know when the punishment actually fits what happened? Is it really about justice, or is it just revenge dressed up in a fancy suit?
Exactly. And then there's the whole question of who gets to decide what's a just punishment in the first place. Is it just the country that got hurt, or do we need like some kind of international agreement on that?
I mean, looking back, it seems like countries used to just, take things into their own hands a lot. Like they had this right to just punish whoever they thought did them wrong.
Right, totally. But now it's definitely more about international law and everyone working together.
And you can see that shift in how we've got international courts and tribunals now. It's like a more, collaborative way of dealing with crimes that cross borders.
It definitely is. But, even with all that, making sure everyone's held accountable and that justice is actually served on a global level, still a work in progress.
For sure. And this whole idea of making a distinction between the people actually doing the fighting and those not involved, that's been like a cornerstone of just war theory for ages.
It has. And the main idea there was always to protect the people who weren't on the battlefield. But warfare, it's changed so much, and it's gotten a lot harder to keep those lines from blurring.
Oh, absolutely. Like with guerrilla warfare, terrorism, all these unconventional tactics, it muddies the waters.
And then you throw in weapons of mass destruction into the mix, right? Something with that much indiscriminate power, it really challenges, like, the very foundation of that distinction.
Right, because how do you even begin to sort through that?
Exactly, and it sparked all these debates about how to take the principles of just war theory and apply them to the way wars are fought now.
Which is a whole other can of worms, to say the least.
It really is. But at the end of the day, finding ways to minimize harm to those who aren't actually fighting, that has to be at the forefront of any conversation about the ethics of war.
100%. And speaking of ethics, intention has got to be a big part of this whole thing, right? It's like, why are you even fighting in the first place?
Absolutely. That's actually a really important point, this idea of right intention. It's like a core principle of the just war tradition. It's not enough to just have a reason to go to war. Those reasons, they have to be justifiable.
So it's not just about like winning at all costs. It's about the goals, the values that are guiding you.
Exactly. Like historically, it's been linked to things like trying to achieve peace or restoring justice or protecting people who are innocent.
All those good things. But realistically, intentions can be pretty murky, right? Like,
Right.
how often is it purely about those noble goals versus being mixed up with things like self-interest or wanting revenge?
Oh, totally. Trying to untangle the real reasons behind a nation's actions. That's like international relations 101, and it's still one of the hardest things to figure out, especially when you've got things like propaganda and hidden agendas floating around.
Totally. Plus, intentions can and do change. Like what starts as a war for one reason can become something completely different over time, right?
All the time. It's why you have to look so closely at the motivations of everyone involved. You have to understand the full context of what's happening.
And even then, it's not always easy to be sure. So on top of intention, there's also this idea of proportionality, right? Which seems like another one of those things that's way harder to pin down in real life than it is on paper.
You're telling me. Because on paper, proportionality basically means that the force you're using should line up with what you're trying to achieve, right? Like, it shouldn't be excessive compared to the harm that's being inflicted.
So it's about using the right tool for the job, essentially, not going overboard.
Right. The idea is to stop things from getting unnecessarily violent, making sure that the force used isn't like way out of proportion to any military advantage you might get.
Which, again, sounds good on paper, but in the heat of the moment, I can't imagine making those kinds of judgment calls.
Oh, it's unbelievably difficult. It means having to weigh the importance of military objectives against the potential harm to civilians and what the long-term consequences of your actions might be.
And you don't always have all the information you need when you're making these choices.
Exactly. It's high-stakes decision-making under a ton of pressure. But even with all that, proportionality is still a really important ethical guideline to have, even in the middle of a war.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that even when things are at their worst, there are still lines you shouldn't cross.
Exactly. It's about restraint and about being committed to causing as little suffering as possible.
Which is a tough thing to balance, for sure. And it feels like we can't talk about reasons for going to war without talking about national honor. Like, how often has that been used to justify a conflict?
Oh, countless times. It's one of the oldest stories in the book. Wanting to defend your nation's honor, especially when it feels like you've been disrespected or threatened, it's a powerful motivator.
It is. It's like this deep sense of collective identity that can be really easy to tap into, for better or for worse.
Exactly. And it can be really easily manipulated, too. Used for political purposes to stir up emotions that might not actually be all that genuine.
And that's when it gets dangerous, because it can lead to this whole cycle of escalation.
Mm-hmm.
One country feels like they have to, outdo the other, respond to any perceived offense with even more force.
Right, and then it just keeps going back and forth. You know, back in the day, you'd have duels to settle matters of honor, and those rarely ended well.
No, they didn't. And even though people aren't really challenging each other to duels anymore, the whole idea of national honor, it hasn't gone away.
Not at all. It's still very much alive and well, especially in international relations.
Which is why it's so important to, recognize when that idea is being used to manipulate things, to try to see past the rhetoric.
I completely agree. Because ultimately, finding peaceful solutions, avoiding bloodshed, those should always be the top priorities.
Couldn't agree more. And speaking of avoiding bloodshed, we can't forget about the international community's role in all of this. How do we deal with something like genocide?
Right. So after the horrors of the Holocaust and other acts of genocide in the 20th century, there was this massive push to figure out how to stop that from ever happening again. That's how we got the United Nations, and it led to a whole bunch of international laws and frameworks to try to prevent those kinds of atrocities.
Yeah, like the Genocide Convention back in 1948. That was a big deal, right? It basically said that genocide was a crime under international law.
Huge deal. And it made it so that countries had a responsibility to stop it and punish anyone who committed it. But here's the thing. Genocide still happens.
It does, which obviously raises a lot of questions about how effective the international community really is at dealing with these situations.
Yeah. Like, when should we intervene? How should we intervene? And then there's the whole debate about a country's right to handle its own affairs. Plus, let's be real, there are always going to be concerns about whether these interventions are really about human rights or if there are other political reasons at play.
Because there almost always are other motives involved, let's be honest.
Right. It's complicated. But finding ways to make the international community better at both preventing and responding to genocide, that's got to be a constant goal.
Absolutely. It's about everyone agreeing that human rights are important and that we need to hold people accountable for these horrific crimes. Which brings us to, like, international criminal tribunals, things like the International Criminal Court.
Exactly. That was a big step. Creating these institutions that could actually hold individuals accountable for their actions, even during a war, was huge.
It was. But actually enforcing international law, that's a whole other story.
Isn't it always? That one's going to take a lot more cooperation between countries and international institutions with a lot more power.
Yeah, because right now it feels like some countries can just do whatever they want with no consequences.
It's definitely a concern. But pursuing justice on a global scale, it's a long game, you know? But it's crucial for accountability, for preventing atrocities, for upholding the rule of law. It all matters.
It does. And that makes me think about how we deal with countries that just don't play by the rules. The ones who ignore international law, develop weapons they're not supposed to, maybe even support terrorism. What do we do about them?
That is the question, isn't it? Because they threaten everyone, right? They make things unstable, not just in their own region, but globally. It's like, do you try to contain them? Do you intervene?
And those options both have a whole lot of baggage that comes with them.
Oh, a ton. I mean, look, military intervention, never a good time. Always a risk that things could go sideways, that you might make things worse instead of better.
And sanctions, I mean, they work sometimes, but they can also really hurt the people you're trying to help.
Yeah.
And don't even get me started on trying to be diplomatic with a country that doesn't want to play nice.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
You've got hostile regimes. You've got countries that just, you don't know if you can trust them. It makes things very difficult.
It does. It's like this constant tightrope walk.
Trying to address the threat, but also trying to avoid making things more violent or unstable, it takes a really delicate approach. And even then, there's no guarantee it'll work.
Which leads us to another fun topic, regime change. Should we be in the business of forcibly removing governments from power?
Yes, the million-dollar question, and one that's definitely open for debate.
Because on the one hand, you've got the folks who say it's absolutely necessary when you've got a government that's a clear and present danger to its own people, or even to global security.
Right, and they'll often point to humanitarian crises, or a country trying to get its hands on weapons of mass destruction as justification.
But on the other hand, you've got people saying, hold on a second, who are we really to tell another country how to govern itself?
Exactly. They'll say it's a violation of that country's sovereignty, that it opens the door for all kinds of abuse, and who's to say that what comes after will be any better?
Because a lot of times, it isn't.
Right. You run the risk of creating more instability, more problems down the line. It's a big decision, no matter how you look at it.
It is. And it's got ethical and political ramifications that you can't just ignore.
Mm-hmm.
So whether or not you choose to go down that path, it's something that requires some serious thought and consideration.
Definitely. You have to weigh the potential benefits against the risks and think about what it's going to mean for that country and for everyone else in the long run.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of tough stuff. So how about something a little more hopeful? Have you ever heard of the idea of a realistic utopia in international relations?
Oh, yeah. That's John Rawls, right?
Yeah. So basically, he imagined this world where you've got all these societies that are functioning really well. They're based on justice and fairness, and they all coexist peacefully.
It's like this vision of a world where war is like a rare occurrence, where international cooperation is the norm. Sounds pretty good, right?
Sign me up. But is it actually possible?
Well, Rawls seemed to think so. He believed that societies that were set up well, that functioned the way they were supposed to, they would see the value in working together.
But they'd realize that a just and fair system benefits everybody.
Right. But getting there, well, that's the tricky part, because you still have to overcome all the things that mess things up. Conflict, people wanting what's best for themselves, the fact that some countries have a lot more power than others.
All the obiisms and the struggles that keep popping up.
Exactly. Overcoming those is essential. So is having open communication, understanding each other, building institutions that promote cooperation and help us work through conflict peacefully.
Sounds like a lot of work.
It definitely is. But Rawls' idea, it's like a roadmap, It's a way of thinking about how we might actually achieve a more just and peaceful world.
It is. It's a good reminder that even though things look kind of bleak sometimes, we shouldn't stop trying.
Exactly. And it means being dedicated to doing things the right way, to talking to each other, to believing that things can get better.
Which, honestly, I think we all need to hear right now.
Yeah.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, let's talk about this idea of do no harm. It's such a fundamental ethical principle.
Right.
But how do you apply that to something like warfare?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Because it's this principle that's so often associated with medicine, with helping people, and war is, well, kind of the opposite, but it's still incredibly important.
It is. Because it forces you to really think about the consequences of violence, of every action you take. It's about minimizing unnecessary bloodshed.
And that's where things get really tricky, because war inherently involves causing harm. It's about trying to achieve your military goals, yes, but it should also be about minimizing unintended harm, about protecting people who aren't combatants.
Which, again, sounds great in theory, but in practice, not always so easy.
Oh, for sure. And the reality is there are some weapons that, by their very nature, make it almost impossible to avoid harming innocent people. Bombs, artillery, things like that.
Right. They don't discriminate.
They don't. And then you add in the fact that war is chaotic. It's unpredictable. Mistakes happen. People die who weren't supposed to. Ethical lines get crossed.
Because in the heat of the moment, it's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture.
Exactly. But even with all that do no harm principle, it's got to stay at the front of our minds. It's a moral compass, It reminds us what the human cost of war really is, and that we should always strive for a more humane approach.
It's what separates us from the very things we're fighting against. Okay, so another thing that's important to talk about, especially in the context of human rights and intervention, is this idea of ordinary repression.
Right, because not every human rights violation is as extreme or as visible as genocide.
It's not always something that makes huge headlines.
Right, but that doesn't mean it's not happening or that it's not causing immense suffering. So with ordinary repression, you're talking about situations where a government is violating its citizens' human rights, but it's not quite at the level of genocide or other mass atrocities.
So maybe there's widespread discrimination, people being thrown in jail for no reason, torture, things like that.
Exactly. Or maybe the government is suppressing free speech, preventing people from gathering in groups, things that we might take for granted in a democracy.
And so the big question becomes, when is it okay for the international community to step in and do something?
And that's where you get all the different opinions, right? You have some people who believe that intervention is always justified when a government is clearly and repeatedly abusing its own people.
Like if they're blatantly disregarding basic human rights, someone has to do something.
Exactly. It's that whole responsibility to protect idea coming back again. But then, on the other side, you have people who are very hesitant to interfere in another country's business.
Right, because then it becomes, who are we to tell another sovereign nation what to do?
Right. And they'll often argue that it's better to try to find a peaceful solution, to let that nation sort things out for themselves, even if it takes time.
Which is a tough position to be in, because in the meantime, people are suffering.
It's true. There's no easy answer. But the bottom line is, deciding whether or not to intervene in a situation like that, it takes a lot of careful thought.
Mm-hmm.
You have to consider how bad the human rights violations actually are, how likely it is that your intervention will actually help, and of course, what the unintended consequences might be.
Because, as we've seen, those unintended consequences can sometimes create even more problems.
And that brings us to another big idea in international relations, this whole democratic peace theory. It's been around for a while.
Right. The idea that countries that are democracies are less likely to, go to war with each other.
Exactly. The people who subscribe to this theory, they say it's because democracies tend to share similar values, like a respect for human rights, the whole rule of law thing.
So they're on the same page, generally speaking, when it comes to how other countries should behave.
Yeah, and because leaders in democracies are accountable to their citizens, they're less likely to start wars that are unpopular or that might put their own people at risk. It's a gamble they're less likely to take.
Makes sense on the surface, but I'm guessing there are some holes in that theory.
Oh, for sure. The critics will say it's too simplistic, like it doesn't take into account all the messy historical stuff, the complicated political realities that factor into these decisions.
It's never just one thing, right?
Never. Plus, there are plenty of examples throughout history where democratic states have gone to war with each other, or they've supported regimes that are anything but democratic.
Right, which kind of throws a wrench in that whole argument.
It does. And then there's the whole debate about what actually constitutes a democracy in the first place. There's a lot of variation there.
Oh, absolutely. It's a spectrum, for sure. But even with the criticism, that democratic peace idea, it still holds a lot of weight in international relations.
It does. I think people want to believe it, you know? It gives us hope that maybe, just maybe, a more peaceful world is possible.
I like that thought. And it kind of ties into everything we've been talking about. Like, if we want to create a more stable world, a more just world, then figuring out the best way to prevent atrocities, to deal with countries that break the rules, that's got to be a top priority.
100%. And a big part of that, of course, is the UN Security Council. They're the ones who are supposed to be in charge of approving interventions.
Because they've got the power, at least in theory,
Yeah.
to make those tough calls.
Right. They can authorize the use of force, including military intervention, if they think there's a threat to peace. But, and it's a big but, Security Council decisions, let's just say they're not always made in a vacuum.
Meaning there's a lot of politics involved.
Always. And the countries with the most power, well, their voices tend to carry a lot more weight than others.
Which, yeah, that makes sense, but it also seems like it could lead to some unfair outcomes.
Oh, absolutely. And there have been times when the Security Council has been criticized for not doing enough to stop atrocities from happening.
Which makes people question, like, what's the point then? If they're not going to use their power to actually protect people.
Exactly. And that's why there's this ongoing discussion about how to reform the Security Council to make it more representative of the world as it is now and more responsive to the challenges we're facing.
So that it's actually effective. So that it can live up to its mission.
Right, because at the end of the day, it's about making sure the Security Council can actually do what it's supposed to do. Maintain international peace and security fairly and effectively for everybody.
Which, if they could pull that off, would be amazing. And on the flip side of that, there's this whole idea of a culture of impunity, which is basically the opposite of what we're talking about, right?
Exactly. A culture of impunity is what happens when people commit serious crimes, like war crimes or crimes against humanity, and they get away with it.
Like there are no consequences for their actions, no accountability whatsoever.
Right. It might be because governments are corrupt, or they're too weak to do anything about it, or maybe international institutions just drag their feet. You know,
or they just don't want to get involved for whatever reason.
Exactly. But whatever the reason, it creates this environment where people think they can do whatever they want without having to worry about the consequences.
And that's terrifying.
It really is. Because a culture of impunity, it undermines the entire system. It means the rule of law doesn't mean anything, which encourages even more abuse. And the victims, they never get justice.
Which just perpetuates the cycle, right?
Yeah.
Because then people feel like the system is rigged against them.
Exactly. It breeds resentment, it breeds distrust, and it makes it that much harder to ever achieve any kind of lasting peace or reconciliation.
Because how do you move forward when you feel like the people who hurt you are just going to get away with it?
It's almost impossible. So if we want to break that cycle, we have to be committed to holding people accountable. And that has to happen on every level, from individual countries to the international community as a whole.
Got to be a group effort.
It does. It means having strong legal systems in place, supporting independent investigations, working with international courts, all of it. Because getting rid of impunity, especially for the most serious crimes, that's absolutely essential if we ever want to create a world that's more just, more peaceful. And honestly, I think we all want that.
I do. And while we're on the topic of justice, it's important to talk about this idea of victor's justice, too, because it comes up a lot, especially when you're talking about international courts.
It does, and it's a valid concern, because the perception that justice is only being served selectively, that it's only for the losers, that can really damage the credibility of the whole system.
Right, because if it's not fair, then what are we even doing?
Exactly. It's why these international courts, they have to go above and beyond to show that they're independent, that they're not just a tool for the winners to use against their enemies.
It has to be about the law, not about revenge.
100%. The law should apply equally to everyone, no matter what side they were on. And the courts have to be transparent about how they operate. It has to be fair, and it has to look fair.
Transparency is key, and that actually makes me feel a bit more hopeful, like maybe we are making progress. Maybe these systems, flawed as they are, maybe they can still work.
I think so too. And I think it's on all of us to hold them accountable, to push for more transparency, for more fairness, for more justice.
Because otherwise, what's the point of any of it? Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about self-defense. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Like, every country has a right to defend itself.
Yeah, it seems like it should be pretty black and white. And to some extent, it is. It's one of the most basic rights a country has, and it's enshrined in international law.
Right, it's part of the UN Charter.
Hmm.
But I'm sure it gets complicated.
Oh, of course it does, because that right to self-defense, it has to be proportional to the threat. You can't just go off the rails because you feel a little threatened.
Right, it has to be justified.
Yeah.
So who decides what's justified?
Well, that's where things get tricky, because there's a lot of gray area. What qualifies as an armed attack in the first place? And when is it okay to strike first, preemptively, to protect yourself from an attack that might be coming but hasn't actually happened yet?
Those are some big questions. And with all the new threats that are popping up, things like terrorism and the spread of incredibly dangerous weapons, it's got to be even harder to navigate.
It's a whole new ballgame. So you've got international law, you've got this idea of proportionality, and then you have to factor in what the consequences of actually using military force might be.
It's a lot of pressure.
It is. But at the end of the day, figuring out how to use that right to self-defense responsibly in a way that actually promotes peace and keeps people safe, that's the goal. Easier said than done, but still.
Absolutely. And this might seem like a bit of a jump, but it's something that I think relates to everything we've been discussing. Have you noticed how often we hear people talking about an enemy of civilization?
Oh, all the time. And it's scary how effective it is at dividing people, at shutting down any possibility of having a productive conversation.
It's like this instant demonization. You slap that label on someone, on a whole group of people, and suddenly they're not even human anymore. They're just evil.
Exactly. And that kind of language is incredibly dangerous because it's used to justify all sorts of extreme measures.
It's how you end up going to war.
Yeah.
It's how violence becomes acceptable, even necessary.
It's true. And it creates this climate of fear and hatred that makes it almost impossible to find common ground, to find peaceful solutions. Because if someone is truly the enemy, how can you even talk to them, let alone negotiate with them?
It's like this self-fulfilling prophecy,
Totally. Which is why it's so important to resist that kind of thinking, to remember that even people we disagree with, even people who scare us, they're still human beings with their own perspectives, their own motivations. And maybe, just maybe, if we can understand those a little bit better, we can start to build bridges instead of walls.
Because at the end of the day, don't we all just want the same things? To feel safe, to take care of the people we love, to live in a world where things aren't constantly on the brink of falling apart.
I think so. It's just about figuring out how to get there together.
Which is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, and it's been intense. But I think it's important to end on a positive note. Because for all the awful things humans are capable of, we're also capable of incredible things.
Oh, 100%. Like, look at how far we've come in terms of international criminal law. The fact that we have treaties and courts that are dedicated to holding individuals accountable for things like genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, that's a big deal.
It is. It means that we're slowly but surely building a system where leaders, soldiers, even regular people, they can't just hide behind their governments or their uniforms anymore.
Exactly. And the creation of international courts like the ICC, it shows that the world is starting to understand that individuals have a responsibility to do the right thing, even during war. And when they don't, they should be held accountable, which honestly gives me hope.
Me too. And it makes me think about this idea of a just and stable world order, which, it sounds kind of pie in the sky, but isn't that what we should be striving for?
I think so. It's the ideal, isn't it? A world where peace is the norm, where everyone's basic human rights are respected, where international law actually means something.
A world where countries work together to solve problems, not create them.
Right, where cooperation trumps conflict. It's a nice thought.
It is, but like you said earlier, it's not going to be easy.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of obstacles to overcome, power struggles, greed, the fact that resources are so unevenly distributed.
We do, and those are huge systemic problems. But it also requires a shift in thinking. We have to start believing that a better world is actually possible.
That it's not naive or foolish to at least try.
Exactly, because if we don't believe it's possible, it definitely won't be.
So on that note, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. It's been a lot to process, but I think it was important to, really delve into these issues.
I agree. And thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure to talk about this stuff, even when it's hard.